quite aware, sensitive to words that are used. I remember being introduced once as a model politician and a model United States Senator and a model South Dakotan and a model U.S. leader. And my wife Linda was with me that particular time, and she showed me the word model as it's defined in the dictionary, and there it's defined as a small replica of the real thing. So I appreciate that Karen chose not to use that word. And as I travel around, and I have been doing quite a bit of traveling this last couple of months in particular, it's interesting what happens to you along the way. I was in Atlanta and I was checking my luggage, and a man right behind me was staring at me for a while. He finally tapped me on the shoulder. And he said, "Can I ever tell you look a little bit like Tom Daschle?" I said, "Yeah, people have actually said that." He said, "Doesn't that make you mad?" So I hope I can get through the hour without making anybody particularly mad. It is truly a pleasure. I have heard about the summit and the center now for some time. As I understand it, this is the 7th summit. And I had the opportunity to spend a little time last night with Karen, and I have to say, you have a dynamic leader, and it is a real pleasure to know her and to work with her. And I know you all feel a sense of gratitude that you've got that kind of extraordinary leadership here in Missouri. So I applaud her and I applaud the center for the extraordinary work that you're doing. Collaboration and education and policy transformation, as well as taking all of the research that is available to us now as a nation and attempting to apply it in a more translational way to our healthcare delivery in this country. And I'm also impressed with the University of Missouri. I wasn't aware of the many distinctions the university has, but to have 1/3 of the freshmen come from the top 10% of all high school classes in the state is a tremendous tribute and a real indication of the caliber of students we have. And I'm delighted that some of them were called upon to stand this morning so that we could recognize them. They are our future. You are our future, and we're really grateful that you're here. I think the principles of the center, respect, discovery, responsibility, and excellence, are the 4 values that I wish we could apply across the board as we consider health policy in this country. We have so much work to do, and unless we show respect, and unless we have this curiosity for greater discovery, unless we take responsibility and commit ourselves to excellence, we will not get this job done. You all recognize that, or you wouldn't have traveled the great distances in some cases that you have to be here this morning. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of this whole debate and the implications for that debate as we look forward. And to start, what I'd like to do is to put it in context. And as I try to put it in context, I would do so in using this word transformational. Because I really believe 2009, perhaps 2010, could be one of those American moments of transformation. I look back to the last 100 years at a time when we saw the critical ability of this country to take challenges we're facing and show the kind of leadership we needed to make the transformational moments the realities that they were. In 1907, we faced a crisis very similar economically to the one that we faced over the course of the last year. It was actually called the Great Panic of 1907. And that transformational moment led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System that we have in place today. It evolved, of course, over time. It wasn't what we started with. We have something a lot more elaborate, a lot more sophisticated than the original creation of the reserve, but nonetheless, that was a moment of transformation. In the 1930s, we saw a similar transformational moment that really was created out of the depths of the Great Depression at that time. And then in the 1960s, many of you are way too young to remember this, but the civil rights battles of the 1960s and Martin Luther King and all of those extraordinary moments in the Mall in Washington and across the country led to transformational legislative accomplishment with regard to the civil rights movements and ultimately the passage of sweeping change and a transformational moment in our history. The same is true at the same time with regard to Medicare and Medicaid. And who can forget how transformational 9/11 was? That tragedy, too, has created moments that have allowed this country to look at security in a far different context than we've ever looked at it before. My point in raising each one of these historical moments is to say that I believe that 2009 and 10 could be that transformational when it comes to the health care that Americans in this country obtain. And whether it does or not will be determined over the course of the next 3 months. We will know within the next 3 months how successful our country will be in addressing many of the many challenges we face. We know that we have a system that is broken. We know that we have an administration determined to address it. We know that the growing realization is that the status quo today is unsustainable. Those things are given facts. I don't think anyone would question that we can't sustain the current track that we're on with regard to health care. And we know that if this is as transformational as it has the potential to be, that it will affect in many respects, large and small, every single American in this country. So the timing of this conference couldn't be any better. I think the opportunities to discuss the implications of this transformation is really the essence of what this conference should be all about. I believe that there's a fairly broad consensus in our country with regard to how we look at the problem. I know that there are people of all philosophical stripes in the audience today. There are Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, and I'd like to think that generally there is a similar assessment of our circumstances today. We may differ with regard to what the numbers are, and maybe even the implications of the numbers. But I don't believe that there's a lot of difference of opinion with regard to the question, for example, of access. We have an access and a coverage problem in this country that is quite serious and is actually getting worse, not better. I looked up just for my own benefit what the access and coverage issues are in Missouri. And I found that about 1.5 million Missourians over the last 2 years went at least part of that period of time without having health insurance. I also recognize that this year we probably crossed the threshold, even though it isn't official, of 50 million people who fit that same category, in large measure because of the state of the economy. With every 1% of unemployment, we see another 1 million people uninsured. So we have crossed thresholds over the last several years with regard to coverage and access that most people recognize are a very serious problem. We also understand, I think, that it isn't just a question of whether you have insurance. It's what quality of insurance you have that makes a difference. And some of the best analytical organizations in the country have said, well, even though one has insurance, that doesn't mean you have access to the care that you need when you need it. And because so many Americans are underinsured, the problems of underinsurance may be just as severe as those with no insurance at all. The lack of dental care, the lack of mental health care, certainly in many cases the lack of long-term care, not to mention the lack of our access to doctors for some of the necessary care we need. And as a result of all of that, it's estimated about 18,000 people every year lose their lives simply because they haven't had access to some form of insurance coverage. A problem develops, they let it go because they can't pay for it. The problem worsens, it becomes acute, and ultimately it becomes such an intractable physical problem that they lose their lives. Well, that is a part of the problem we face in healthcare today. And the problem is getting worse. Small businesses, those businesses with fewer than 50 employees, used to insure the bulk, the majority of their employees. 61% of people who worked for small business in 1991 had coverage. That figure this last year dropped to 38%. So there's been a precipitous decline in your ability to get coverage through your employer. The second problem that I think most people are willing to agree is one that motivates a lot of the concern for health reform, has to do, of course, with cost. In part because of the cost shifting that occurs because people don't have health care, estimated to be about $1,100 per family. There is a significant increase in the degree of costs that we have now experienced, 40% just in the last decade. Last year, we crossed another threshold in the cost factors as well. For the first time in history, we actually spent about $8,000 per capita in taxes, premiums, and out-of-pocket expenses on costs. When I was born, a few years ago, health costs were 4% of the gross domestic product. When my children were born, that figure had gone to 8%. When my grandchildren were born, it went to 16%. And the Council of Economic Advisors now reports that if we do nothing, when my great-grandchildren are born, if I have them, one more generation away, that number will be 32%. A phenomenal and unsustainable increase in costs that ought to be of concern to every American. The New American Foundation noted that here in Missouri, if we do nothing by the year 2016, it is estimated that we will see a 129% increase in insurance premium costs here in Missouri, and the figure for 1 year for a family of 4 would be $25,616, which would represent about 50% of a Missourian's income. That is the unsustainable trend that we're on if we do nothing. And Starbucks spends more on health than they do on coffee, and Ford spends more on health than they do on steel. We know that is a problem. This is the only sector in our economy where when the purchase is made, we aren't sure who's going to pay and what it's going to cost. And I think we have to understand the implications of that as we go forward. If we don't know who's going to pay or what it's going to cost, and we have no way of controlling these costs in the out years, we are destined to find ourselves struggling with more than just health problems as we look at the implications for the economy in the future. So the third problem that I think most people also are willing to acknowledge, even though there are differences of opinion on why we have the problem of quality that we do, but there is a growing realization that we have a serious quality problem in this country. One doesn't have to accept the fact that we have, as we look to the problems of access and the problems of cost, the implications of quality, but they're there. We have the finest research in the world. We have the finest technology in the world. And oftentimes I think our people confuse the quality of our technology, the quality of our research for the quality of the overall outcomes. And we can't confuse those any longer. We have some of the finest institutions in the world. I had the good fortune to be on the Mayo board for a while, and that is one of those institutions that I believe is an extraordinary demonstration of quality. But not everybody has access to the Mayo Clinic, or to Intermountain, or to Geisinger, or to any one of the finest institutions we have around. And as a result, Commonwealth, one of the analytic organizations, lists us 19th out of 19 industrialized countries when it comes to outcomes. The World Health Organization listed us 37th, just below Costa Rica and above Slovenia. Now, there are societal issues that have to be addressed if we're going to improve quality. There are a lot of other issues that fall outside the context of health itself. But we can't ignore the fact that we have a serious and growing quality problem in this country that has to be addressed. All of these problems have led to a growing concern across the board in our society. Doctors are very concerned about the current state of health care in this country, in part because of their fear of malpractice, in part because of their frustration with paperwork, in part because of the high costs that they have to incur to pay for the insurance just to provide care in the first place. Business is concerned about operating costs and competitiveness. Governments are concerned about the quality of life and the implications for budget. I know that Missouri is struggling to address the economic and budgetary implications that they're facing and are forced to look at healthcare as one of the ways in which to reduce spending, again, having huge implications for people in this state. Families, of course, are concerned not only about the cost of their insurance, but the fact that they could be one illness away from bankruptcy. There are two other problems that I think are becoming more widely recognized that I want to share with you. One of those problems, and I say it's a problem, some people might differ with me with regard to my description of this question. I call it a problem because I don't believe America truly has a health system. Unlike all other industrialized countries, we don't have a means by which to manage our health system. We have a series of systems. We have a series of managerial infrastructures that sometimes interact and sometimes they don't. In many cases, they're like stovepipes. We have no equal way with which to access the system. So I much prefer to call what we have in America a marketplace rather than a system. And I think that if we recognize the marketplace as a place where everybody tries to take as much advantage of this place as they can, you begin to understand why we do a lot of the things that we do. So I think it's important for us to look at that and decide for ourselves whether this private-public entity that we call a system is really more of a market than it is a system. And I would hope that we could look at that much more carefully as we consider the options for reform that are now being contemplated. The other issue that I would describe about this marketplace is that every healthcare system in the world looks much like a pyramid, where at the base of the pyramid you have good primary care, good wellness, and as you work your way up and become more and more sophisticated until at the very top of the pyramid you have the most sophisticated technological applications to health. Every country starts at the base of the pyramid and they work their way up until the money runs out. In the United States, we actually start at the top of the pyramid and we work our way down until the money runs out. And in spite of the fact that we now spend $8,000 per capita, the money runs out. And people don't get to the base of their pyramid. And the question is, does it make sense for us to invert the pyramid and do what every other industrialized country has done and do our level best to cover the entire pyramid, given the fact that we spend as much as we do, but put the emphasis at the base of the pyramid rather than at the top? And that is also a question for health reformers that I think is one that I hope can be resolved favorably. I think there's also a general recognition about what the goal should be. If we accept largely those problems as real ones, the question then is, what do we do about it? And what should we state as our common goal? Well, I would suggest that a succinctly stated goal could be as follows. We want a high-value, high-performance healthcare system based on greater access, better quality, and lower costs. That seems to me to be basically where most people would like to go. A high-value, high-performance system based on better access, greater quality, and lower costs. To do that, health reform really encompasses not one, but three different definitions. In order to accomplish that goal, it seems to me we have the need for significant insurance reform. Secondly, I think there's a need for significant payment reform. And third, and somewhat controversially, but I think a growing recognition that we also need to accept the fact that we have to create opportunities for better delivery reform. Delivery, payment, and insurance reform are the three contexts within which we look at healthcare today. And in spite of the fact that even on that there is significant agreement conceptually, the problem is we have significant differences of opinion across this country, perhaps even in this room, about how we get there. In part, those deep divisions on solutions relate to the deeply seated political polarization that exists in this country today. Not by any means the only time in history we've faced deep political polarization, but it certainly exists today. Probably here in Missouri just as much as across the country, and certainly in Washington. There are very complex questions. This may be the most complex sector of the economy. I would argue that it is the least transparent sector of the economy. And it's hard to fix what you cannot see. And because it is so opaque, that also challenges us as we try to resolve many of the differences. And finally, the stakes couldn't be any higher. They're high politically in part because they are high economically. And as a result of those high stakes, the differences and the special interests that understandably play themselves out all do so in a very profound way. I'm often asked, so what are the chances today for success? I will give you my answer to that, but before I do, let me list what I consider to be the single biggest factors, and there are 4 of them, that will determine ultimately whether we are successful. The first of the 4 factors, in my view, is the most consequential, and that is to find a way to bridge the ideological divide that exists in this country today about the role of government in healthcare. Other countries have already come to their own conclusions about what that role is, but we have not. And over the years, we've sort of evolved to the position we're in today. Some people still call our system a private system. It is not a private system. It's a hybrid public system, where almost half of the resources allocated go to public entities and half go to private entities. So that hybrid system today is where we are, and the question is, on the spectrum, from less to more government, where should health reform lie? And that deep ideological tug of war is going on as we speak in Washington, D.C. Republicans are saying largely we want less. Democrats largely are saying we want more. And that is playing itself out in a lot of contexts as we look at insurance reform, delivery reform, and payment reform. I'm hopeful that we can bridge that chasm. I'm hopeful that we can find a way to bring people together. But that is by far, in my view, the single biggest factor in ultimately whether or not we're successful. The second has to do with the realization that if we are going to invert the pyramid, if we are going to create this new architecture, it's going to take resources. And those resources are now estimated to be approximately $1 trillion. That's a ton of money, especially given the fact that we are in debt this year by $1.4 trillion, more than at any other time in our history. And the question is, can we find the resources? And frankly, there are only 3 buckets from which to find them. The first is new revenue. The second are cuts in current federal programs, transferred revenue thereby transferred to new spending in health. And third, to a certain extent, and it's a much smaller bucket, how much modernization can be accomplished in the first 10 years to provide some savings dedicated to the new architecture. Those are the only 3 buckets you have to reach the $1 trillion. And as you can see from the debate that's going on, not only between Republicans and Democrats, but among Democrats, about how we reach that $1 trillion threshold, that is a major factor in determining whether or not we're going to be successful. The third factor has to do with stakeholders. In the past, stakeholders have been, in my view, one of the most consequential of all of the factors. And the fact that, in large measure, most stakeholders in the last 70 years in particular have been virtually unanimous in opposition to reform has had a huge impact on our inability to move forward. I think it was one of the best strategic decisions the administration made to invite the stakeholders to come in early. It was controversial. Some people said they didn't cut a very good deal, but nonetheless, the stakeholders were all invited in, and the stakeholders, by and large, have stayed in the room with regard to the need for meaningful health reform. And as a result, that has made a big difference. The question now is, will they stay in the room? I think it is noteworthy that AHIP, the organization representing the insurance companies in this country, have decided for the first time now that they are going to be taking out television ads criticizing the health reform efforts now underway in Congress. And those ads could start as early as next week. The Chamber of Commerce as well is beginning to do that. So this very loose and fragile coalition is becoming more fragile and even more loose, and that could ultimately be a factor. Whether it's too little, too late is an open question, but that is a major question as well. The final factor has to do with something I'm probably a little bit more sensitive to and familiar with, and that is, what will be the legislative strategy that the Congress uses? And I will tell you, the legislative strategy that we used in 93 and 94, and I was the chairman of the policy committee at the time and have to take some responsibility for what we did, was a disaster. And because it was so short-sighted and because we made so many mistakes, we actually deserved to lose, given the way we went about it. But we've learned a lot, and we're applying a lot of the lessons learned to this set of circumstances. But the degree to which we see presidential leadership and the degree to which we see a legislative strategy that is built on lessons learned, in part, is a significant factor in determining whether or not we're going to be successful. There is some confusion about how the legislative process is going to play out over the course of the next 3 months, and I want to touch just briefly on that. The legislation actually is running on 2 tracks, not one. The first track is what we commonly call the policy track. The policy track has 5 committees of jurisdiction, 3 in the Senate, 3 in the House and 2 in the Senate. Those committees have began their work last spring. They completed their work in the case of the last committee about a month ago, and we are now through the first phase of the policy track. That is the committee stage. The second phase of the policy track involves the merging of the bills, which was completed just yesterday in the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi and a large group of members of the Democratic caucus unveiled the product of that merging process yesterday. Senator Reid and the Senate Democrats are likely to do the same thing next week. That's the second phase. The third phase of the policy track is the actual floor debate. And that will actually begin next week in the House of Representatives and probably the week after in the United States Senate. The hope and expectation is that this third phase of the policy track will be completed by Thanksgiving. Now, the policy track in the Senate these days, and I say these days because it didn't used to be this way, these days require 60, not 50 votes. So if they can't get to 60 votes by Thanksgiving on the policy track, they will then move to the budget track, and I'll come back to that in just a second. If they are successful in getting 60 votes, they move to the fourth stage of the policy process, which is what we commonly call the conference, where the differences between the House and the Senate are worked out, and they're hoping to devote the month of December to the conference, that final stage, and put the bill on the President's desk before Christmas. That's the goal. But it all hinges on whether they get 60 votes in that third stage, that is the floor stage. If they fail to do that, they move to the second track, which is called the budget track or reconciliation. The budget track has 2 advantages and 1 disadvantage. The advantages are, from the perspective of those who want to move this legislation forward, that the threshold for passage drops from 60 votes to 50 votes. That's a dramatic difference. And the time for consideration depending on the circumstances, will be no more than 40 hours and perhaps as few as 20 hours. So there are no filibusters. So there is an expedited, fast-track process by which the legislation will pass. We actually have used the budget track approach for things like the State Children's Health Insurance Program, SCHP, in 1997. It was used for the Bush tax cuts in the early part of this decade. So it has been used for legislation other than budget for some time. The disadvantage is that because not everything is considered budget related, as much as a fourth to a third of the legislation would have to be extracted from the bill. And that presents some real problems from a policy perspective that will have to be addressed at some point in the future. But nonetheless, that remains as the legislative plan B, should we be unsuccessful on the policy track before Thanksgiving. There is some consensus today, even I'd say on a bipartisan basis, about some of the things that ought to be included in health reform. And as you get to be more and more party-centric, you can define these consensus items even more clearly. But I would say, as a whole, there is a general consensus today that creating a system, and I'll use that word, creating a system for the first time that would allow coverage for all is something that enjoys pretty broad support. A recognition that everybody in this country, like every other industrialized country, should have access to health care. I think there's also a consensus that we ought to try to find ways with which to ensure that if you have something that you like today as an insurance product, you ought to be able to keep it. We shouldn't take it away if you're satisfied with it. So providing Americans with the maximum degree of choice with regard to their insurance is something for which there is a good deal of support. There's also fairly strong support about the new architecture that would be created if we were to devise this new system. And that new architecture, insurance-wise, would simply be pooling resources, perhaps on a state-by-state basis. In my case, I'm from South Dakota, and Karen didn't say this, I was elected in 1978 for the first time by 14 votes, which in my state is 60%. And because my state is so small, we couldn't create actuarially probably the pool we need in a state as small as mine, and so we probably pool with other states. But there'd be either state or regional pools within which a new marketplace would be created. A marketplace that is commonly referred to as an exchange. Within that exchange, insurance companies would be allowed to participate if they did two things. One, they provided what we call guaranteed issue. Everybody would be provided insurance regardless of circumstance, and that guaranteed issue is fundamental to getting to universal care. And secondly, if they would accommodate all of those subscribers with what we commonly call a community rating, modified only to age. And the age variance would be anywhere from 3 to 1 to 5 to 1, some suggest even 7 to 1. And that criteria would be required in order to participate in the exchange by any insurance company. So there would be competition within that pool for those who would participate, and over time, more and more people would be allowed to enter that exchange, including small businesses today that oftentimes can't afford health insurance in any other way. So there's a good deal of consensus roughly around that framework, and I'll come back to some of the issues that are still unresolved in a moment. There is also a fairly strong consensus about the need to invert the pyramid, and that is put the emphasis on good primary care and wellness. I find a lot of support for that across the spectrum in Congress today. There's a lot of support for a lot more transparency, and there is a significant amount of support, and no one is better able to talk about the implications for this than Karen is, but on the need for health information technology. I oftentimes say that I think We have a 21st century operating room. We have a 19th century administrative room. And all one has to do is to go through the clinics and many hospitals today to see those hallways and hallways of manila folders to know how 19th century oriented we still are. Only about 13% of all providers today use HIT. And there will be significant incentives and, in some cases, requirements as we go forward for the system to embrace technology as a core factor on whether or not we can bring about meaningful reform. We can't do most of what we need to do unless we have technological applications that we simply aren't using today. It, in many respects, is the backbone to our ability to do the kinds of reform necessary. So I can't emphasize enough how critical it is that we embrace it enthusiastically and do as much as possible to acquire it as quickly as we can. There is a good deal of support as well for delivery reform in concept. There's a good deal of support for a recognition that we don't manage chronic illness well in this country, and that if we're going to solve the problems relating to cost, access, and quality, solving our delivery challenges, including providing a better way with which to address chronic care management, is critical. Accountable care organizations and moving from volume to value as we go forward are things that are largely embraced. The problem is, as we get into the weeds and become more specific, we begin to see more and more resistance. There is resistance right now to a system-wide application of comparative effectiveness research and evidence-based medicine. I'd like to think that we could someday get there, but you will see very aggressive efforts at research, demonstration, and pilot projects to find ways in which to accelerate that process. And my hope is, and my expectation is, to a certain degree, the Department of Health and Human Services and other newly formed entities, too many to mention at this point, but nonetheless newly formed entities will be given the authority to move the system ultimately in the direction of meaningful delivery reform. And I believe that's a good thing, but it will be evolutionary, and it certainly won't be immediate. There's also significant interest in meaningful payment reform. Again, moving away from the volume-driven system we have today, largely fee-for-service, and more towards value. And while there is, again, a great deal of support generally for this notion of meaningful payment reform, and a recognition that we can't solve our health cost problem until we solve our health payment problem, there is a significant degree of work to be done in reaching a consensus on moving to bundled or globalized, and I may even dare put out the word capitated prospects for meaningful payment reform. But clearly, while there's support in general for the concept, we have a lot of work to do with regard to the way it's implemented. There's also a recognition that we have to deal with unnecessary care. And there are a lot of forms of unnecessary care. My three largest categories are first, defensive medicine. Defensive medicine is oftentimes the result of concerns by doctors and other providers that they're going to get sued, requiring unnecessary tests and unnecessary procedures that ultimately drive up the cost of care. My view is that if we could provide an opportunity for doctors to use best practices and evidence-based medicine, that we give them safe harbor from lawsuits and create a new mechanism for dealing with the problems associated with malpractice, so that doctors become real advocates and partners rather than adversaries. The second area of unnecessary care is proprietary care. That is where a health practice becomes more a health business. And we overutilize equipment in clinics in part because there is a profit-driven motivation there that becomes too great. And we see a lot of proprietary care today, and that's problematic. The third problem we have is one that I call market-driven care. Advertising on television today is prolific. The only thing that exceeds political ads are drug ads, it seems. And those drug ads have a huge impact. We didn't see drug ads until 1984, but it has become a significant part of the problem in unnecessary care. People see the ad, they go to their doctor, they want the drug, and the doctor oftentimes will give it to them. That kind of unnecessary care as well is something that will have to be addressed in my view. And again, while there's great support for the notion of addressing unnecessary care, we have a long way to go with regard to the ways with which we do that. Nonetheless, that is a very important part of health reform as well. I think, in summary, the agreement with regard to health is significant as it relates to insurance reform. The agreement with regard to delivery and payment reform is very significant at the 30,000-foot level, far less significant and tangible at the 5,000-foot level or the ground level. We still have a long way to go, and I'm hopeful that people will see health reform not as the end, but really as the beginning. That this really launches something that will take a while to ultimately achieve and accomplish. But if we have the tools in place, there is a lot we can do over the course of the next several years. Let me quickly go through the areas for which there is significant disagreement. There is significant disagreement today on what the role of government should be in offering insurance. That is, what, if any, kind of a so-called public option should be provided as one of the choices in these exchanges. My guess is that there will be some form of a public option in the final product. What it will be yet is unclear. Most likely, it will be one which involves a great deal of flexibility among states, whether it's opt-in or opt-out. If I had to guess today, most likely the best they're going to get is a trigger. I could be wrong, but a trigger, as you may or may not know, refers to certain circumstances that would trigger a public option within a certain number of years if those circumstances are not met, especially if it involves largely the coverage question. But a public option still is a source of great discussion and consultation and confrontation as we look at prospects for health reform. And I mentioned earlier the financing package, how do you get to $1 trillion, is still one that is very much an outstanding issue. We haven't come to any consensus with regard to financing, nor have we come to consensus about mandates. I don't believe you get to universal coverage unless you mandate that coverage be required. That is, that every individual take the responsibility. I believe health care is a right, but I also believe it has to be an individual responsibility. And on that question, there is still outstanding differences of significant degree. There is also a difference of opinion with regard to the degree to which employers should be mandated to participate in the system. There are differences of opinion as to whether there should be minimum insurance levels required within the exchanges. Should we prescribe a certain actuarial value? That is outstanding. As is the subsidy levels themselves. What should be the level of subsidy to ensure that it's affordable for all working families, all families, in Missouri and across the country? As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of difference of opinion on medical malpractice and how we address it. I'm hopeful that we can move forward in that regard, at least put in place some ways in which to look at it and fix it. The whole question of CER and best practices. Who decides what best practices are and what CER is used under circumstances that have yet to be determined? And then finally, how fast we move away from the fee-for-service system and to a new framework for payment reform is something that has yet to be decided and consensus reached. Finally, what kind of management? If we are going to have a system, what is the management going to look like? What kind of an architectural design do we want to draw so that there is some semblance of a system unlike that which we have today? And that question is outstanding, and I'd be happy to talk about it more if you have questions about it. So I would say the prospects today, as we consider where we are in this process, I would say the prospects for success are about 60%. That is, I don't think it's anywhere near as much of a certainty as some might suggest. We still have so many obstacles out there. There still is a lot of work to be done. So my view is that it's about 60%. I had many mentors when I was in public life. One of my mentors was Claude Pepper, a wonderful man from Florida who was first a senator and then a member of the House. He had an office about the size of this room, it seemed, when I came in to see him on many occasions. He had pictures on all of his walls, and on one wall in particular, there was an historic array of pictures that really everyone was drawn to. And in part it was because of two pictures that hung side by side. One was a picture of an old biplane, and you couldn't really make out who the men standing were there, but there was, down at the bottom it said, "To our dear friend Claude Pepper, Orville and Wilbur Wright." Right next to it was a picture of a moonscape, and you couldn't make out that moonscape or the person standing there, but down at the bottom it said, "To my dear friend Claude Pepper, Neil Armstrong." A pretty remarkable span of history. And I just love to listen to him and to talk to him, and I got a lot of great advice from him over the years. He used to tell me that a legislator oftentimes feels a little bit like the guy at the horse race in Kentucky late on a Saturday afternoon. There were 5 horses in the race, and this older man in his 90s kept going to the betting window, said, "I want to put $100 on Bluebell." A little while later he came back and he says, "I want to put another $100 on Bluebell." The race was about to start, and he was walking to the window a third time, and a young guy walked up to him and he said, "Look, I've been watching what you're doing, I just feel terrible. Bluebell can't win. I know I own Bluebell." The old man looked at him and he said, "Well, it's going to be a darn slow race then, because I own the other 4. Well, that's sort of how you feel about the legislative process. You're kind of betting on the other horses because the prospects of success are sometimes overwhelmingly small. But he also gave me a couple pieces of advice that I've always felt were so important. One, he said, it's not as important whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, an R or a D, as to whether you're a C or a D, whether you're a constructive or a destructive in this process. He said, I hope you'll always try to be a constructive. Don't just try to destroy something. Try to come up with better ways to do something. Roll up your sleeves. Don't care who gets the credit. And what I'm hopeful of is that we can still find ways for policymakers, legislators, and others to be C's rather than D's. And how much we are able to achieve that goal, that is, a coalition of C's, will determine ultimately whether that 60% goes to 80 or 90%. And he also said something else. If you're going to be successful, you better have 20/20 eyesight. He said, by that, and then he took his glasses off, he said, I have Coke bottle glasses. I'm not talking about my physical eyesight. It's my interest and involvement in the process. How engaged are you going to be? How much 20/20 eyesight will you show? You all have shown remarkable 20/20 eyesight by coming to this summit and by being involved. And I'm hopeful, and one criteria that I oftentimes throw out as my test for how involved you are. If you don't know the name of your Health LA, of the Health LA, of the member of Congress and the 2 senators, then you probably haven't shown quite enough 20/20 eyesight. Use that as your criteria. Have I talked to the Health LA for my member of Congress or my 2 senators? If I haven't, then maybe I'm just not as engaged as I should have been. This could be truly a transformational time in American history. This could be an historic moment that we look back on 10 or 20 years from now and say, I was there. The question is, were you there? Did you show 20/20 eyesight? Whether or not it's successful is up to us. And it's up to the members of Congress who rely on us for our best advice. 2 of my other heroes were also relevant in this debate. One is Winston Churchill, who I love to quote. One of my favorite lines of his was that Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility. And secondly, and this is from Nelson Mandela, Nelson Mandela once said to his cellmate, who was despondent, to say the least, about whether apartheid will ever end in South Africa, and who said, it's virtually an impossibility for apartheid to ever come to any conclusion, to end in our country. Nelson Mandela's admonition to his cellmate was, well, many things seem impossible until they're done. For the last 70 years, health reform has seemed impossible. But given the need, given the opportunity, and given our commitment, it too could be done. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Senator Daschle. That was a wonderful opening talk. We appreciate your passion and your commitment to this important issue. We actually have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing your comments. We all
enjoy them very much. It's clearly a very complex problem in a very complex and interrelated system, and the solutions are not going to be simple. It seems to me personally a bit naive to expect after 10 months of bickering in Washington, we're going to get a solution that's going to really be as effective as we wanted to. I believe, if I have understood some of your prior writings, you also have some concern about how we can sustain this, and is this something that a government can do themselves, or should we just look to government as an enabler and look for solutions with some other body? I think you referred to the Federal Reserve System earlier in your talk, and I think you proposed something similar to that. Could you comment on where we're going forward? It looks like we're going to get legislation. My guess is there'll be a grand victory party, and then everybody in Washington moves on to climate. This is going to take some time to do. Can you offer your thoughts on how we get down that road?
I appreciate the question a good deal. I've been asked if I could, for purposes of video and other things, to try to repeat the question. There is understandable skepticism about whether or not we can do all of this, and whether we can sustain meaningful reform even after the balloons have been launched and the bill has been signed. And is there a need for some sort of framework that would allow for us to come to expect more of a system architecture than what we have today? And the questioner was asking whether what I wrote about in my book, the Federal Reserve, is one model that may or may not apply. Well, I start with the belief that, as I said in my speech, and I think it's so important to emphasize over and over, we should never look at the passage of this bill as the end. It really is just the beginning. And my expectation is that the beginning will get us maybe about a third of the way at most, maybe not even that far, maybe 25% of the way. And that it's going to take implementation and perhaps even further legislation for us to build on the new framework that we are hoping to put down. And that's going to take a while. So first of all, let's think of it in that context. Let's say this is transformational, but it's not the end, it's the beginning. And secondly, if it is the beginning, does it make sense for us, recognizing that we have more of a market than a system today, to try to create a better system? And if we are going to have a system, and my two best examples of this are our monetary system and our aviation system. In both cases, we have a hybrid public-private architecture. Our monetary system is public and private. Our aviation system is public and private. And what do we have? We have an architecture within which decisions are made. they're different. The FAA makes them independent of any outside board. They decide the architecture in terms of all of the issues that allow us to fly from Columbia to Washington or to Paris and be fairly confident that we're going to be safe. The FAA does that very well. Whether we fly coach or business or first class is up to us. But the government has created a system that allows for a framework to get us there safely. I believe that, and I realize that I won't get unanimity here, I think the Federal Reserve does that by and large with our monetary system. I don't agree with everything they've done in monetary policy, but it's a framework. I think the time has come for us to have a similar framework when it comes to healthcare, to get us safely through life, if I can use that metaphor. And I think that is going to be required over time. We aren't going to do it as a result only of this legislation, but I think it's time we move in that direction.
We have time for another question.
On the issue of Medicare payment reform for physicians, it seems as if you have, for example, orthopedic surgeons that make $1.5 million per year, and you have family practitioners who are barely bringing in $150,000 per year, yet they're on call all the time. And you talked about the inverted pyramid. Is there any willingness to sort of scooch the top down a little bit and raise the bottom up? I mean, you wouldn't have to upend the whole thing just to add a little bit of equity to the system, which is not there right now.
Well, that's a great question. The question is, can we create incentives? Can we change the payment structure to accommodate the realization that if we're going to provide for better primary care, we have to reward those who provide it? And the answer to that question is yes. Emphatically, there is an understanding of the importance of that. In my view, it doesn't go as far as I'd like it to, but there are three things that we do. The first is that there's automatically a 5% increase in reimbursement, even under the fee-for-service system through Medicare, for primary care doctors and all primary care providers. That is important, and I think it's a beginning, as I said. The second thing they do is to make, as part of insurance reform, a lot of the primary care approaches to better health as sort of a minimum benefits requirement. There has to be access to good primary care. This is a crass way of saying it, but you have to follow the money in our system to the extent that there is one, or we put it at least in this marketplace. If you follow the money today, all the incentives go in the wrong direction if we really want to invert the pyramid. So they're beginning to put the incentives in place, first with regard to payment reimbursement, and secondly with regard to eligibility for good primary care. The third thing that they're doing is increasing the availability of National Health Service Corps funding to reduce the costs of medical school, and once again using a proven mechanism. That is, the National Health Service Corps provides scholarships of real magnitude in order to assist in providing for medical education with the commitment that doctors serve in underserved areas after that. That's important as well. I am frankly troubled, and I realize this may be a little controversial, but I am troubled by the fact that we import 5,000 doctors a year in the United States. That's the equivalent of 100 medical schools with 50 graduates every year from developing countries. Countries that need those doctors more than we do. And I say it's controversial because I don't want to ever deny and welcome people to come to this country, but I frankly would love to see them serve their own people in ways that are so necessary, and I think that's so critical. But that's something we have to work on as well. We're going to have a doctor shortage, and we'll have one of two choices. We can increase that 5,000 to 10,000, which may be the trend we're on if we do nothing, or we can do the kinds of things that will help follow the money in our own marketplace, and I hope that is the approach we use.
I think we'll stop there, and join me again in thanking Senator Daschle. we're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back at 9:45 for the panel. Bathrooms are over there.
I wasn't